5 years later, Beauty still couldn't forgive herself. Not because she failed, but because she once held the very answer to her prayers in her hands and let it slip through her fingers. Every stitch she made now carried a memory. Every fabric she touched reminded her of what could have been, if only she had listened. There was a time when Beauty was just a young woman with a quiet dream and a life that felt louder than she could manage. A dream that didn't shout for attention. It didn't come with applause or support. It lived quietly inside her, steady, persistent, refusing to die even when everything around her made it difficult to believe. But the burden she carried, that one was loud. Loud in the unpaid bills she tried not to think about. Loud in the expectations she felt but could never quite meet. Loud in the silent comparison between her life and others who seemed to be moving ahead faster, easier. By day, Beauty was a school teacher. She stood in front of children with a smile she had learned to wear well, explaining lessons, correcting books, managing noise and energy and endless questions. To anyone watching, she looked stable, responsible, put together. But what they didn't see was how much it took from her. The long hours, the mental exhaustion, the quiet frustration of knowing this wasn't where her heart truly belonged. And yet, she showed up every single day because she had to survive. But at night, everything changed. The classroom faded, the noise disappeared, and Beauty stepped into a different version of herself. A dreamer, a fighter, a fashion designer in the making. Her room was small, not the kind of space you would imagine creativity thriving in. Sometimes it was too hot to think clearly. Sometimes the air felt heavy. Sometimes the only sound was the hum of an old machine and her own tired breathing. There were nights power would go out, and she would sit there staring at unfinished fabric, waiting, hoping the light would return. Because every minute mattered. Her tools were not perfect. Some were borrowed, some were worn, some barely worked the way they should, but she used them anyway, carefully, patiently, determined. Under dim light and borrowed strength, Beauty would sit for hours, sewing, adjusting, cutting, rethreading. Starting again when things didn't go right, her eyes would ache, her back would hurt, her hands would slow down from exhaustion. But she kept going, not because it was easy, not because she had everything she needed, but because somewhere deep inside her, beyond the stress, beyond the fear, beyond the uncertainty, she believed. She believed that one day this small room would not be her only workspace, that one day her designs would not go unnoticed, that one day the same hands that struggled in silence would create something seen, valued, and respected. And so, night after night, when the world rested and her body begged for sleep, Beauty chose to keep sewing, because to her this wasn't just fabric and thread. This was hope. This was faith in motion. This was her way out. But the journey was not kind to her. It didn't unfold the way she had imagined it in her hopeful moments. There were no shortcuts, no sudden help, no soft landing. Fashion school was expensive, more expensive than she had prepared for. Every new term came with a fresh list of requirements: tools, fabrics, threads, materials she had never even heard of before she started. And each time, she would stare at the list, doing silent calculations in her head, already knowing the truth. She didn't have enough. Materials cost more than she could afford, not just once, not just occasionally, constantly. Prices kept rising. What she managed to afford last month suddenly became out of reach the next. She would walk through fabric stores slowly, touching what she couldn't buy, asking for prices she knew she couldn't meet, nodding as though she had options. Then she would leave, empty-handed. Practical classes demanded tools she didn't have. And in fashion school, theory meant nothing without practice. Others came prepared, complete kits, quality tools, confidence in their steps. Beauty came with determination, and sometimes just enough to get by. There were days she had to improvise, days she had to wait for others to finish so she could quickly use what wasn't hers. Days she worked under pressure, trying to catch up before time ran out. Not because she was slow, but because she was behind before she even started. There were days she had to borrow money just to complete an assignment. Not large amounts, just enough to survive the moment. But even that came with weight. The uncomfortable conversations, the promises to repay, The quiet embarrassment of needing help again and again. Still, she asked. Because stopping wasn't an option she was ready to accept. There were days she skipped meals so she could buy fabric. Days when hunger sat quietly in her stomach while she focused on cutting and stitching. Days when she told herself, "I'll eat later," knowing later might not come. But in her hands and the fabric felt like a step forward, and sometimes that was enough to keep her going. There were days she almost gave up, not casually, not lightly, real moments. Moments when she sat down, looked at everything around her, and wondered if this dream was too big for someone like her. Moments when quitting felt like relief, when walking away felt easier than pushing through another day of lack, stress, and uncertainty. But somehow, she didn't. Because in the middle of all the noise, the pressure, the quiet tears, she didn't show anyone. There was a voice, not loud, not forceful, but steady, persistent, unshaken. Don't stop. She didn't always understand it. She didn't always feel strong, but every time she got close to giving up, that voice met her there. Don't stop. And so she kept going, not because everything made sense, not because the path was clear, but because something greater than her circumstances kept calling her forward. And she chose again and again to answer. Still, there was something else in her life, something that didn't look like a problem at first, but slowly became one. Isaac. In the beginning, their relationship felt right. Not just emotionally right, but spiritually right. They met in a setting that made it easy to trust him. He spoke about God. He used the right words. He carried himself in a way that felt calm, grounded, reassuring. To Beauty, it felt like confirmation, like maybe, just maybe, God had given her someone who understood her season. Isaac was attentive. He listened when she spoke. He checked on her. He showed up. And in a life where she was constantly pouring out, to her job, to her dreams, to her struggles, having someone who seemed to pour back into her felt like relief. At first, he even encouraged her. "Your designs are nice," he would say. "You're trying." It wasn't overwhelming praise, but it was enough. Enough to make her feel seen. Enough to make her believe she wasn't alone. But slowly, something began to change. Not suddenly, not in a way she could easily point to. Just gradually, his words began to shift, subtly. "You're stressing yourself too much. Why are you doing all this? Are you sure this fashion thing will even work? Maybe you should just focus on something more stable." At first, it sounded like concern, like someone who cared about her well-being. But over time, it started to feel different. He wasn't just asking questions. He was planting doubt. The same dream that once felt alive inside her began to feel heavier when she talked about it with him. The same passion that kept her going at night began to feel like something she needed to defend. And without realizing it, Beauty began to adjust. She stopped talking about her plans as much, stopped sharing her ideas freely, stopped expressing the full depth of what she believed she could become. Not because she no longer believed, but because every time she did, she felt smaller afterward. Isaac never shouted. He never openly tried to stop her, but his presence carried a quiet weight, a kind of pressure that didn't break her all at once, just slowly reduced her. And somehow, without noticing the exact moment it happened, Beauty began to shrink. But God did not leave her without a voice, Sarah. While Isaac brought confusion, Sarah brought clarity. Sarah didn't always have solutions. She didn't have money to offer. She couldn't fix Beauty's situation overnight, but she had something more powerful. She had discernment. Sarah would sit with her, sometimes on the bare floor, sometimes in silence before they even spoke. And then she would say, "Let's pray." Not short prayers, not casual, routine words, but deep, desperate, faith-filled prayers. The kind that came from a place of knowing that only God could make a way. They prayed for open doors, they prayed for help, they prayed for direction, they prayed when things made sense, and especially when they didn't. And many nights, Beauty cried. Not polite tears, not controlled emotions, but real, heavy tears that came from being stretched beyond what she thought she could handle. Not because she didn't believe, But because she was tired, tired of trying, tired of waiting, tired of caring so much with so little to show for it, and still, she prayed. At some point, the weight of the relationship became too heavy to ignore. It wasn't loud. There were no dramatic scenes, no explosive arguments, nothing you could easily point to and say, "This is clearly wrong," but something inside her knew. She noticed how she felt after talking to him, drained, uncertain, distant from herself. She noticed how her faith felt weaker in that space, how her vision felt smaller, how her voice felt quieter. And one day, in the middle of everything, the truth settled in her heart. This is not where I am meant to stay. And somewhere along the line, Beauty began to notice the difference. Not immediately, not clearly, just in small, quiet moments. Moments when she would leave conversations with Isaac and feel heavier than before. Moments when she tried to explain her plans and ended up defending them instead. Moments when her excitement slowly turned into hesitation. There were times she questioned it, not out loud, but within herself. Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel smaller after talking to him? Is this normal? But every time those thoughts came, she brushed them aside, because nothing was obviously wrong. There were no loud arguments, no clear reason to walk away, just a quiet discomfort she couldn't fully explain. And so she stayed. She told herself, maybe it's just a phase. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe things will get better. And slowly, what once felt like clarity became confusion. At the same time, Sarah remained consistent, unchanging, grounded, spiritually sensitive, and the contrast became clearer, even if Beauty didn't act on it yet. Because while one voice made her question her path, the other reminded her of it. And deep down, Beauty knew, but knowing is not always the same as acting. So she kept going, caught in between two influences, one pulling her toward purpose and the other quietly pulling her away from it. Then, slowly, things began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, in ways so small they could easily be overlooked if you weren't paying attention. It started at home. Her parents began to notice her consistency, the late nights, the fabrics, the quiet determination that refused to fade. And without making a big announcement about it, they began to mention her to people. Casually at first, "Beauty can sew," they would say. "She's learning. She's actually getting better." It wasn't marketing, it wasn't strategy. It was simple word of mouth. But somehow it began to work. One person came, then another. A neighbor needed a small adjustment. Someone wanted a simple dress for a child. Another asked for something not too complicated. Beauty took every job seriously. No matter how small, she would measure carefully, ask questions, redo things if they didn't sit right. Even when the payment was little, the effort was not. Then something surprising started happening. She began to attempt things that were slightly more complex, designs she once thought were above her level, and somehow, they came out well. Not perfect, but impressive. People began to say things like, "Wait, you made this? This looks really good. You're actually very talented." Those words did something to her, not pride, but confirmation. It wasn't big. There was no sudden breakthrough, no large income, no viral moment, but it was something. And for the first time, her hands were not just practicing, they were earning. Small amounts, but honest ones. And in that season, something deeper began to grow in her. Confidence. Not loud confidence, but quiet, steady belief. Then came the day everything changed. Her brother Daniel had never really taken her seriously. To him, Beauty was still in that uncertain phase of life, still trying things, still figuring it out, still not fully established. He wasn't cruel about it, but he was dismissive. In his mind, she hadn't proven anything yet. But one day, something unexpected happened. Beauty made a dress, not just any dress, but a dress for Daniel's fiancée, Glory. This time she approached it differently, not casually, not as just another job. She slowed down, measured twice, adjusted patterns carefully, chose the fabric thoughtfully. Every stitch carried intention. Every detail mattered. She wasn't just sewing, she was presenting herself, because something in her spirit kept whispering, "This one matters." She didn't rush it, even when it took longer than expected. Even when she had other things to do, she gave it her best. When Glory finally wore the dress, something shifted. She stood in front of the mirror, turning slightly from side to side. Her face lit up, not just with satisfaction, but genuine excitement. She adjusted the sleeves, smoothed the fabric, looked again. Then she smiled and walked straight to Daniel. "Who made this dress for you?" he asked, noticing immediately. Glory smiled. "Your sister." Daniel paused, not out of disbelief alone, but because something in her tone caught his attention. "Beauty made this?" he asked again. "Yes," she said, "and she's really good." That moment changed everything. For the first time, Daniel didn't see her as someone struggling. He didn't see the late start. He didn't see the inconsistency. He saw skill. He saw potential. And more importantly, he saw seriousness. A few days later, he called her. "Do you have a plan?" he asked. The question caught her off guard, not because she didn't expect it, but because it sounded like opportunity. Beauty froze for a brief second. Her mind raced. Then, something surprising happened. She said yes, because she did. In the quiet moments of her struggle, in between exhaustion and prayer, Beauty had been thinking ahead. She had written things down, not in a perfect document, not professionally arranged, but intentionally, a plan. Late nights when sleep wouldn't come, she would sit and imagine, if I had the opportunity, what would I do with it? And she answered that question on paper. When she brought it to Daniel, her hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of the weight of the moment. Inside that proposal were her dreams, no longer just in her heart, but structured and written. A small but standard fashion studio, 5 industrial sewing machines, 1 overlock machine, work tables and pressing equipment, 1 or 2 assistants, branding and signage, proper record-keeping system. It wasn't just a list, it was vision. She had thought it through. She had imagined it. She had prepared for it, long before anyone asked. Daniel read it carefully, not rushing, not interrupting. For the first time, he was paying full attention. Then he looked up at her. "For once," he said quietly, "you look serious about your life." Beauty didn't respond. She just watched him, waiting. Then he said something she would carry in her heart for years. "I'm going to support you." Her breath caught. "I'll give you enough to start properly." For a moment, she couldn't process it. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Not controlled, not hidden, just real. "But listen," he continued, "this is not a loan you should rush to pay back." He paused. "But you must be accountable. Keep your records straight. Build something real. Don't waste this." His words were not just instructions, they were trust. And trust, right, is a heavy thing to carry. That day, Beauty went home and cried. Not out of pain, not out of confusion, but because, after all the waiting, all the struggling, all the nights she almost gave up, God had answered. Not in the way she expected, not suddenly, not magically, but clearly. And in that moment, everything felt possible again. But what she didn't know was this. Answered prayers often come with tests. Somewhere along the line, something shifted again. Not in her business, not in her environment, but around her. Isaac, who had been distant, quiet, almost absent, suddenly reappeared, not with conflict, not with tension, but with a softness she hadn't felt from him in a long time. The calls became more frequent, the messages more intentional. His tone changed. "Hey, I've been thinking about you. I'm sorry for how I was before. I didn't understand you then, but I see it now. I want to do better." At first, Beauty was careful, not fully open, not fully trusting, just observing. But there's something about familiar affection. When it returns in a season of breakthrough, it feels different, stronger, more convincing, and slowly, the walls she didn't even know she had built began to come down. This time he listened, really listened. He asked about her plans. He sounded supportive. He spoke like someone who finally believed in her. And Beauty believed him. It didn't happen all at once, but little by little, his words began to settle in her heart again. Apologies turned into conversations. Conversations turned into closeness. And before she realized it, the same voice that once made her question herself felt safe again. Around that same time, something else began to happen. Beauty started withdrawing, not physically at first, but inwardly. She stopped sharing as much with Sarah, avoided certain conversations, delayed returning calls, and when Sarah would ask deeper questions, Beauty would respond lightly, briefly, sometimes not truthfully. "Everything is fine. I'm just busy. It's nothing serious." But it wasn't nothing. It was as though something had shifted spiritually. The same sensitivity she once had began to dull. The same clarity that once guided her began to fade. And without realizing it, her spiritual ears were becoming quieter. Not because God stopped speaking, but because other voices had become louder. Even when Sarah prayed, Beauty felt distant, disconnected. There were moments Sarah would say things that sounded like warnings, gentle, loving, spirit-led. But instead of receiving it, Beauty found herself thinking, maybe she doesn't fully understand. Maybe she's just being too careful. Maybe this is different. And slowly, what used to be conviction became justification. Then came the conversation that would change everything. Isaac listened as she shared the news about the money. Fully attentive, interested. Then he said it. "Do you know what this money can become?" Beauty hesitated. "Before you know it, a year is gone. Rent, expenses, everything will finish it." His words were calm, reasonable, almost logical. Then he leaned in slightly. "Why not invest it?" She looked at him. "Crypto, something fast. Multiply it first, then you can do everything you plan." And just like that, a new thought entered her mind. Her heart started racing. It sounded smart. It sounded strategic. It sounded like wisdom disguised as opportunity. But deep down, something didn't sit right. Not loudly, not enough to stop her immediately, but enough to make her pause. And in that moment, she did the right thing. She called Sarah. "Do you think it's a good idea?" Beauty asked. There was a pause, not hesitation, discernment. Then Sarah said gently, "Beauty, no, don't do it. That money came with direction. Don't let another voice change what God has already shown you." The words were simple, but heavy. Beauty went quiet, because deep down, she knew Sarah was right. She remembered the plan, the clarity, the way everything had come together. She knew, but knowing does not always stop desire, because something else had already entered her heart. The thought of more money, more speed, more results. And once that seed is planted, it begins to grow. Days passed. She thought about it, again and again, weighing both voices, replaying conversations, trying to convince herself one way or the other. But slowly, her emotions began to align with what she wanted, not what she knew. Until one day, the decision no longer felt difficult. It felt justified. And that was the moment everything shifted. She invested the money. At first, everything seemed fine. Nothing alarming, no immediate signs. She waited, checked updates, refreshed her phone, watched numbers, hoped, told herself it will grow. This is the right move. It will all make sense soon. Then it dropped, not slowly, not gradually. Suddenly, everything crashed. Her breath caught. Her hands began to shake. "No, no, no," she refreshed again and again and again, trying to reverse it, trying to understand it, trying to fix what was already gone. Then she called Isaac, once, twice, again, her heart beating faster each time. No answer. Silence. That was the moment it hit her, not as a thought, but as a reality she could no longer deny. The money was gone. Not part of it, not half, all of it. All of it, every plan, every preparation, every answered prayer, gone. Silence filled her room, the same room where she once prayed for breakthrough, now held the weight of loss. And this time, there were no words, no explanations, no voices, just her and the consequence of a decision she knew she should never have made. She couldn't call Daniel. She couldn't explain. She couldn't face him. And when he eventually found out, he didn't shout, he didn't argue. He just stepped back, disappointed. That hurt more than anything. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Regret became her companion. Why didn't I listen? Why did I ignore Sarah? Why did I allow that voice back in? She started again, not from absolute nothing, but from what was left of her. The one machine she had struggled to buy before was still there, old, worn, but still working. And this time, there were no big expectations, no plans neatly written, no excitement about expansion, just survival. She returned to what she knew, small jobs, adjustments, simple dresses, children's wear, the kind of work that kept her moving, but reminded her of where she should have been. Because every time she sat down to sew, the memory followed her. The plans she had written, the machine she was supposed to have, the shop she was supposed to open, the life that almost began. And this time, the silence was louder. She didn't talk about it, not to her parents, not to Daniel, not even to Sarah, especially not to Sarah. Calls became fewer, messages became shorter, until eventually, distance replaced connection. Not because Sarah left her, but because shame made Beauty withdraw. Daniel, too, changed. He didn't insult her. He didn't remind her of what she did, but something shifted. The trust was no longer the same. The confidence he once had in her faded quietly, and Beauty felt it. Every time they spoke, every time they didn't. So she stopped trying to explain, stopped trying to fix what couldn't be undone. She just adjusted. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. She worked, she delivered, she collected small payments. Life continued, but something inside her didn't. The confidence she once had became caution. The boldness she once carried became hesitation. The vision she once saw clearly became something she avoided thinking about. Not because she didn't want it anymore, but because it reminded her of what she lost. Years passed, 5 of them. On the outside, Beauty was okay. She had a small space, a few steady customers, enough to get by. Nothing remarkable, nothing broken, just existing. But inside, it was different. She carried the memory of that decision like a quiet burden, a question that never fully left her. What if I had listened? And no matter how much time passed, that moment remained, unresolved, unhealed, unforgiven. Because the truth was, Beauty didn't just lose money, she lost confidence, she lost trust. She lost a version of herself she had not been able to find again, and slowly, without realizing it, she became a quieter version of who she used to be. Not completely broken, but no longer whole, still moving, but not fully alive. And somewhere deep within her, buried under routine, silence, and regret, was a part of her still waiting to be restored. And Beauty had no idea that the hardest part of her story was not losing the opportunity, but learning how to live after it. This was not the end of Beauty's story. Sometimes the real damage isn't what we lose, it's what we become after the loss. If you want to see what happened to Beauty after this moment, subscribe and don't miss part 2. Like, share, and subscribe. God bless you.